I moved into Oak Ridge Estates 7 years ago. The neighborhood represented everything I had worked toward: mature oak trees lining clean streets, tasteful homes with manicured lawns, and a community pool that buzzed with activity during summer months. The homeowners association fees seemed reasonable for the amenities provided, and the rules appeared straightforward enough. Keep your lawn maintained, no exterior modifications without approval, trash cans out of sight except on collection days. Standard protocols for maintaining property values. My home sat near the back of the subdivision, a modest three-bedroom with a two-car garage that I had specifically chosen because it could accommodate my pride and joy, a 1972 Century Coronado wooden boat. I had purchased the vessel in terrible condition 3 years before moving to Oak Ridge. The mahogany deck had been rotted, the upholstery torn, and the engine more rust than metal. But beneath the decay, I saw potential that no one else could recognize. Weekends and evenings disappeared into restoration work that transformed the boat into a gleaming testament to craftsmanship. The experience connected me to memories of my grandfather, who had taught me about boats during childhood summers at his lakeside cabin. His lessons had stayed with me long after he was gone. The first 2 years at Oak Ridge passed without incident. I kept to myself mostly, working from home as a graphic designer, tending to my lawn dutifully, and spending free time meticulously maintaining the boat. Neighbors would occasionally stop to admire the Coronado, asking questions about its history or restoration process. I always took time to chat, enjoying their appreciation for something that represented so much personal meaning to me. Everything changed when Gerald Hartman became HOA president. The previous board had operated with a light touch, addressing genuine issues while allowing reasonable autonomy for homeowners. Gerald approached his position differently. He had retired early from corporate management and seemed to view the HOA as his new kingdom. His campaign promises focused on increasing property values and strengthening community standards, innocuous phrases that masked an authoritarian approach to governance. The first board meeting under his leadership should have been a warning. Gerald arrived with a 3-inch binder full of proposed amendments to the community bylaws. His voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. When homeowners raised concerns about stricter regulations, Gerald dismissed them with corporate platitudes about shared community vision and market-based valuations. Only later did I realize he was systematically expanding board powers while reducing homeowner rights. My first personal encounter with Gerald occurred on a Saturday morning as I washed the Coronado in my driveway. He approached with clipboard in hand, introduced himself formally, and proceeded to inform me that recreational vehicles were prohibited from being stored in driveways according to HOA regulations. "This is not a recreational vehicle," I explained patiently. "This is a classic wooden boat on a trailer. The bylaws specifically address RVs, campers, and commercial vehicles." Gerald smiled thinly. "The board has recently clarified the definition to include all towable items, including boat trailers. You will need to store this elsewhere or face fines beginning next month." When I reviewed the bylaws that evening, I found no such clarification. The next day, however, all residents received an email announcing bylaw interpretations that had allegedly been discussed at the previous meeting. No vote had been taken. No minutes recorded this discussion. Nevertheless, Gerald had unilaterally expanded definitions to target specific items he found personally objectionable. The first violation notice appeared on my door 2 weeks later. The second arrived 3 days after that. Though I requested hearings as permitted by the bylaws, meetings were mysteriously rescheduled or quorum requirements suddenly changed. Other neighbors began receiving similar notices for infractions that had never previously warranted attention. A divided community emerged, those who submitted quietly to avoid conflict, and those who questioned the increasingly arbitrary enforcement. Then came the morning I discovered the first act of vandalism against my boat. The cover had been slashed in multiple places, exposing the meticulously restored interior to recent rainfall. Water pooled in the seats, already causing damage to the leather I had painstakingly replaced. As I stood there assessing the destruction, I noticed Gerald walking his dog past my house, slowing just enough to observe my reaction before continuing his morning routine. The violations multiplied over the next 3 months. My grass was 1/4 inch too tall according to a measurement Gerald himself had apparently taken. My garbage can remain visible from the street for 3 hours after collection, rather than the newly mandated 2-hour maximum. The American flag displayed on my porch required board approval for non-standard exterior decorations. Each notice arrived with increasing fines and decreasing response windows. I began documenting everything methodically. Photographs showed identical violations at other homes that received no citations. Weather records disputed claims about my lawn maintenance during periods of heavy rainfall. I collected emails, notices, and certified letters in a growing file that revealed a pattern of selective enforcement. When I shared my findings with several neighbors, they contributed their own experiences. Thomas and Maria Guzman had been cited for their holiday decorations, despite winning the community decoration contest the previous year. Elderly, Mrs. Peterson received violations about her garden gnomes that had stood undisturbed for 15 years. What troubled me most was discovering that these targeted residents shared one common factor. They had all questioned Gerald during community meetings. The connection seemed obvious to us, but nearly impossible to prove definitively. Gerald operated with just enough plausible deniability to maintain the appearance of proper procedure. I had planned a weekend visiting my sister in another state, a rare break from the ongoing neighborhood tension. The drive provided 4 hours of peace, and my sister's home offered sanctuary from the increasingly hostile environment at Oak Ridge. We spent Saturday catching up over dinner, and I deliberately avoided checking email or answering calls from unknown numbers. The psychological respite felt necessary for my mental health. Sunday evening, my temporary peace shattered when my phone rang at 9:47 p.m. The caller ID showed my next-door neighbor Frank, a retired police officer who had become an unexpected ally in documenting Gerald's abuses of power. "You need to come home right now," Frank said without greeting. His voice carried the urgent tone I recognized from his law enforcement days. "There is a fire at your house." "Is it the house?" I asked, already grabbing my keys and heading toward the door. "No, it is your boat, and it does not look accidental." The 3-hour drive home compressed into a blur of highway lights and worst-case scenarios playing through my mind. I called the local fire department en route, confirming they had responded to the scene and that the fire had not spread to my home. The dispatcher could not provide details about the cause but mentioned an investigator would be on scene. I smelled the acrid stench of burning fiberglass and wood from 2 blocks away. Fire trucks still occupied my driveway, their red lights painting the neighborhood in surreal pulses. Neighbors stood in small clusters on lawns, some in bathrobes, others fully dressed despite the late hour. As I parked across the street and approached on foot, the full devastation became apparent. The Coronado no longer existed in any recognizable form. The elegant mahogany deck had collapsed inward, creating a charred cavity where polished wood and chrome fittings once gleamed. The engine compartment gaped open, blackened metal twisted by intense heat. Water and foam from fire hoses pooled around the trailer, carrying bits of burned debris across my driveway. The boat that had represented countless hours of loving restoration work was now irreparable. A firefighter approached as I stood motionless before the destruction. "Are you the owner?" he asked gently. I nodded, unable to form words. "The fire investigator would like to speak with you when you are ready." The investigator was a compact woman with short gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had seen too many tragedies. She introduced herself as Captain Reyes and led me away from the immediate scene. "I want to be direct with you," she said, flipping open a notepad. "This fire shows clear signs of arson. We found accelerant patterns consistent with gasoline poured in multiple locations. This was deliberate and premeditated." The confirmation struck me physically, a wave of nausea rising as my suspicions transformed into certainty. "Do you have any suspects?" I asked. "We are collecting evidence and witness statements. Several neighbors reported seeing someone near your property approximately 1 hour before the fire was reported. We are following up on all leads." As Captain Reyes continued explaining the investigation process, Frank appeared at my side. He waited for the investigator to finish before speaking quietly. "3 people saw Gerald walking past your house tonight. Mrs. Peterson was walking her dog and saw him near your boat about an hour before the fire. And then Sandra across the street noticed him watching from across the cul-de-sac when the fire trucks arrived. He was just standing there, watching it burn." The firefighters departed around midnight, leaving behind yellow caution tape and the skeletal remains of my boat. The neighborhood gradually quieted as residents returned to their homes, expressions of sympathy and offers of support trailing behind them. Eventually, I stood alone in my driveway, surrounded by the destruction of something irreplaceable. The boat had been more than wood and metal and engine parts. It represented a connection to my grandfather, countless hours of painstaking craftsmanship, and the simple pleasure of peaceful days on water. As I surveyed the wreckage in the pale glow of streetlights, grief gradually hardened into resolve. Gerald had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He had destroyed something precious, believing it would break my spirit and force my compliance or departure. In that moment, standing amid the charred remnants of my boat, I made a decision. This would not end with my defeat. This would end with justice and accountability. I did not yet know how, but I would find a way to ensure Gerald Hartman faced consequences for what he had done. The acrid smell of smoke clung to my clothes as I finally turned toward my house, the first glimmers of a plan beginning to form in my mind. The following weeks passed in a haze of grief, anger, and determination. I took 2 weeks of emergency leave from work, explaining the situation to my understanding manager. My dining room table transformed into an investigation headquarters, laptop open, documents spread across the surface, and a large corkboard where I mapped connections between incidents. Sleep came in brief, restless intervals, interrupted by nightmares of flames and the lingering smell of smoke that seemed permanently embedded in my nostrils. The official police investigation proceeded with frustrating sluggishness. Despite multiple witness statements placing Gerald near my property before the fire, the evidence remained circumstantial. No security cameras had captured the actual act of arson. Gerald provided alibis for the critical timeframes, claiming he had been at a restaurant and then at home watching television. Without direct evidence connecting him to the accelerant or ignition, the police could not move forward with charges. "We know he did it," Detective Morris told me during our third follow-up meeting. "But knowing and proving are different challenges in our legal system. We need something concrete to take to the prosecutor." I nodded, understanding the frustration in his voice matched my own. "I will keep looking." My systematic canvassing of the neighborhood revealed an unexpected ally. The Thompsons, who lived 4 houses down from mine, had recently installed a comprehensive security system following a series of package thefts. Their driveway camera had a partial view of the street approaching my house. When they checked archived footage from the night of the fire, we discovered something significant. The grainy nighttime video showed a figure walking toward my property at 8:17 p.m., approximately 90 minutes before the fire was reported. Though the distance and darkness obscured facial features, the distinctive gait and build matched Gerald. More importantly, the figure carried what appeared to be a small container. The return journey, captured at 8:34 p.m., showed the same person without the container. While not definitively incriminating, the footage contradicted Gerald's claim that he had not been in the vicinity that evening. I provided the video to Detective Morris, who agreed it was helpful but still insufficient for an arrest warrant. "Keep digging," he advised. "People like this get sloppy when they think they are untouchable." With the criminal investigation moving slowly, I redirected my energy toward understanding the HOA power structure that had enabled Gerald's reign of targeted harassment. My research began with Oak Ridge Estate's governing documents, articles of incorporation, bylaws, amendments, and meeting minutes from the past 5 years. I discovered the troubling progression of Gerald's influence even before becoming president. As a regular board member, he had systematically proposed amendments that concentrated authority while reducing oversight and transparency. Most homeowners, myself included, had paid little attention to these incremental changes. We skimmed meeting minutes without recognizing the cumulative effect of seemingly minor adjustments to quorum requirements, notification procedures, and enforcement protocols. Gerald had effectively rewritten the rules to create his personal fiefdom while maintaining the appearance of democratic process. My investigation expanded beyond Oak Ridge Estates. I discovered Gerald had served on HOA boards at 3 previous communities. Online searches revealed newspaper articles describing controversial leadership and resident complaints at each location. A pattern emerged of Gerald moving between communities every 5 to 7 years, always leaving amid tension, but before formal action could remove him from power. The breakthrough came during my 3rd consecutive night researching state laws governing homeowners associations. Bleary-eyed from reviewing legal statutes, I almost missed the critical provision buried in Section 720.305 of the state code. The language described an emergency mechanism, allowing homeowners to legally freeze all HOA operations pending investigation when evidence indicated governance violations and financial improprieties. I reread the statute multiple times, confirming my understanding of its implications. The provision required documented evidence of multiple bylaw violations by the board, financial mismanagement, and signatures from at least 25% of homeowners. If these conditions were met, a court could issue an injunction halting all HOA operations, including fee collection, violation enforcement, and financial disbursements, until an independent audit and investigation concluded. The next morning, I consulted with Andrea Patel, an attorney specializing in HOA disputes. Her office overlooked the city courthouse, and her walls displayed framed news articles covering significant cases she had won against predatory boards. I presented my research, documentation, and the security footage to her during a 2-hour meeting. "This is actually one of the most comprehensive cases of HOA abuse I have encountered," Andrea said, reviewing my evidence. "Most homeowners give up long before collecting this level of documentation. The statute you identified is rarely invoked because it requires substantial evidence and community support, but it could be extremely effective in your situation." "How do we proceed?" I asked. "We need financial records," she explained. "Your documentation shows clear procedural violations and selective enforcement, but the freeze provision specifically requires evidence of financial impropriety. Without access to those records, we cannot meet the statutory threshold." I frowned, considering the obstacle. Gerald has been resistant to financial transparency. Requests for detailed accounting have been consistently denied or delayed. Andrea nodded thoughtfully. "There is another approach. The bylaws should guarantee homeowner rights to inspect financial records. We can formally invoke that right, documenting any refusal as additional evidence of improper governance." As we developed our strategy, Andrea helped me understand the larger context of HOA abuse. What makes these situations particularly insidious is how they exploit community trust and legal complexity, she explained. Most homeowners lack the time, resources, or expertise to challenge improper actions. Boards like Gerald's count on that ignorance and intimidation to maintain control. I left her office with renewed purpose and a concrete legal strategy. This was no longer solely about my destroyed boat or personal vendetta against Gerald. The scope had expanded to community justice and systemic reform. Gerald had wielded HOA authority as a weapon against anyone who challenged him. I would use the law as a shield for the entire community. That evening, I reviewed everything I had learned. The pieces were connecting into a comprehensive picture of corruption and abuse of power. The boat's destruction, while personally devastating, had inadvertently set in motion something much larger than Gerald could have anticipated. He had burned my boat believing it would break my spirit. Instead, he had ignited a determination to expose and dismantle the corrupt system he had carefully constructed. As I organized my evidence and planned next steps, I realized something important had changed within me. The grief remained, but it no longer paralyzed. It fueled a methodical resolve that would ultimately prove more powerful than Gerald's vindictive destruction. For the first time since the fire, I slept soundly, no longer haunted by images of flames, but instead focused on the path toward justice that was taking clear shape before me. The legal mechanism for freezing HOA operations required substantial evidence of financial mismanagement. Andrea filed formal requests for complete financial records on my behalf, citing specific bylaw provisions guaranteeing homeowner access. As expected, Gerald and the board responded with evasive tactics claiming records were being organized for audit or temporarily unavailable due to software transitions. Each denial and delay was documented meticulously, creating additional evidence of obstruction. Our breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Linda Morgan, the HOA treasurer, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Gerald's financial directives. A retired accountant with professional ethics still guiding her decisions, Linda had maintained private copies of all financial transactions despite Gerald's instructions to limit documentation. She contacted me after hearing about my records request. "I cannot be directly involved," Linda explained during our clandestine meeting at a coffee shop 20 miles from Oak Ridge. "Gerald has made it clear that board members who challenge his authority face consequences, but I can provide these copies of the actual financial records." The documents revealed disturbing patterns. Gerald had directed landscaping contracts to Green Valley Services, a company owned by his brother-in-law, at rates significantly higher than competing bids. Community pool maintenance had been assigned to AquaPerfect, despite 3 documented complaints about service quality and a connection to Gerald's former business partner. Most concerning were unexplained administrative fees, totaling over $40,000 during the past year, with minimal documentation and no board approval recorded in meeting minutes. "This is exactly what we needed," Andrea confirmed after reviewing the documents. "The financial mismanagement is clear and substantial. Now we need community support to meet the 25% signature requirement." Building that support required careful strategy. Gerald had cultivated an environment of fear and isolation among Oak Ridge residents. Many homeowners who privately expressed frustration remained unwilling to publicly challenge the board. I needed to create a coalition strong enough to withstand intimidation tactics. I began with residents who had already experienced Gerald's targeted enforcement. Thomas and Maria Guzman had been fined for their holiday decorations despite previous compliance. Mrs. Peterson continued receiving notices about her garden that violated no actual bylaws. The Johnsons had been denied approval for a disability access ramp for their son, despite ADA protections. Each household represented not just a potential signature, but also additional documentation of selective enforcement. Frank, my retired police officer neighbor, proved invaluable in this effort. His professional background lent credibility to our cause, and his extensive community connections helped identify other affected homeowners. He organized small gatherings in different sections of the neighborhood, allowing me to present evidence and explain the legal strategy without attracting Gerald's immediate attention. "This is not just about individual grievances," I explained during these meetings. "This is about restoring proper governance and protecting our community from abuse of power." The coalition grew steadily over 3 weeks. Veterans like Mr. Ramirez were outraged to learn about Gerald's attempts to restrict flag displays. Young families resented arbitrary limitations on children's play equipment. Longtime residents observed how community cohesion had deteriorated under Gerald's divisive leadership. Each new supporter contributed additional documentation of questionable board actions. The most compelling evidence came from the Wilkinsons, whose architectural modification request had been approved and then mysteriously revoked after they questioned a suspicious special assessment. Their security cameras had captured Gerald entering the community clubhouse after hours on multiple occasions. Cross-referencing these dates with document timestamps revealed Gerald had been altering official records and removing posted complaints from the community bulletin board. As our evidence and support base grew, so did Gerald's awareness of organized resistance. His tactics escalated accordingly. Supporters of our coalition received increased violation notices. Anonymous letters appeared in mailboxes warning about troublemakers threatening property values. Gerald scheduled an emergency board meeting to discuss community harmony and compliance protocols, thinly veiled language for strengthening enforcement powers. Andrea advised caution and discretion. "He knows something is happening, but not the specific legal strategy. Let him focus on intimidation tactics while we complete our documentation package." By the end of the 4th week, we had gathered signatures from 63 households, representing 32% of Oak Ridge estates and comfortably exceeding the 25% threshold required by statute. Our evidence binder contained over 300 pages of documented violations, financial irregularities, witness statements, security footage, and supporting legal analysis. Andrea filed the petition with the county court on a Tuesday morning, requesting an emergency injunction to freeze all HOA operations pending investigation. The judge assigned to the case, Honorable Elaine Watkins, had previously ruled on several HOA disputes and established a reputation for protecting homeowner rights against overreaching boards. "The hearing is scheduled for next Friday," Andrea informed me. "The court has ordered that all parties be notified, which means Gerald and the board will receive summons tomorrow. We should expect significant pushback between now and the hearing. That pushback began almost immediately. Emergency notices appeared on doorsteps announcing a mandatory HOA meeting the following evening. The agenda included ominous items like legal contingencies and enforcement protocols for community protection. Gerald clearly intended to mobilize support and possibly implement defensive measures before our petition could be heard. This actually works in our favor, Andrea noted. The monthly meeting was scheduled for next week anyway. Their hastily arranged emergency session demonstrates awareness of wrongdoing and attempt to obstruct justice. Judge Watkins will take note of this reaction. We used the narrow window to prepare our community allies for the confrontation ahead. Each coalition member received detailed guidance about their legal rights, talking points for the emergency meeting, and instructions to document all interactions. We emphasized calm professionalism and adherence to proper procedure, creating a stark contrast to Gerald's increasingly desperate tactics. The evening before the emergency meeting, I stood in my driveway where the boat had once rested. The scorch marks on concrete remained visible despite repeated cleaning attempts. The destruction of something I loved had set in motion events Gerald could never have anticipated. His act of vindictive arson, intended to break my spirit, had instead catalyzed a community awakening and legal reckoning. I felt a strange sense of calm as I contemplated the confrontation ahead. Our legal strategy was sound, our evidence compelling, and our community united in purpose. Gerald had weaponized HOA authority against individuals he perceived as threats. We would use proper legal channels to restore governance based on fairness and transparency. The final pieces were in place for a showdown that would transform Oak Ridge Estates and establish accountability for the man who had burned my boat to break me. The community clubhouse parking lot overflowed 30 minutes before the emergency meeting. Residents who typically avoided HOA gatherings arrived early, drawn by rumors of significant developments. Gerald had selected the smallest available meeting room despite anticipated attendance, a transparent attempt to limit participation. Coalition members arrived early to secure seating, bringing additional folding chairs from the storage closet despite objections from Gerald's supporters on the board. I arrived 15 minutes before the scheduled start, accompanied by Andrea and Frank. We carried 3 identical binders containing complete documentation packages, evidence of financial irregularities, procedural violations, and selective enforcement. A 4th binder contained signature pages from community members supporting our petition. The court summons was secured in Andrea's briefcase, ready for formal service at the appropriate moment. "Remember the strategy," Andrea whispered as we entered the packed room. "Let him control the initial proceedings. Document every procedural violation. Wait for the public comment period before making our move." Gerald sat at the central table, arranging papers with exaggerated precision. His tailored suit and power tie projected authority and control, but the tightness around his eyes betrayed underlying tension. Board members flanked him, most looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact with residents. Only Vice President Wilson, Gerald's consistent ally in questionable decisions, displayed the same smug confidence. At precisely 7:00 p.m., Gerald called the meeting to order with 3 sharp gavel strikes. "This emergency session of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association will now come to order," he announced in his practiced corporate voice. "The board has called this meeting to address urgent community matters requiring immediate attention." The procedural violations began immediately. Gerald bypassed standard roll call and approval of previous minutes. He introduced an unannounced executive session motion, attempting to remove residents from the room during sensitive legal discussions. When several homeowners objected, citing bylaw requirements for proper notice, Gerald dismissed the concerns with condescending assurance that the board was acting within its authority during emergency circumstances. Andrea documented each violation in meticulous handwritten notes, building additional evidence of improper governance. The coalition members remained calm and professional, raising procedural questions at appropriate intervals while carefully avoiding the appearance of obstruction. Each exchange highlighted the contrast between Gerald's authoritarian approach and the community's reasonable expectations for proper procedure. When Gerald attempted to introduce a special assessment for legal contingency funding, without prior notice, Mr. Ramirez, a coalition member and retired attorney, cited the specific bylaw prohibiting financial decisions without proper community notification. Gerald's face flushed with barely controlled anger as he was forced to withdraw the motion. After 30 minutes of increasingly tense procedural maneuvering, Gerald reluctantly opened the floor for public comments. "Speakers will be limited to 2 minutes each," he announced, setting a timer on his phone. "Comments must address only the specific agenda items approved by the board." Several coalition members spoke first, raising concerns about procedural irregularities and requesting greater transparency in board decisions. Gerald interrupted repeatedly, citing time limitations and relevance restrictions. The community's growing frustration became palpable as Gerald dismissed legitimate questions with bureaucratic deflection. When my turn arrived, Andrea and Frank stood alongside me at the podium. The room fell into expectant silence. I placed our documentation binder on the table and looked directly at Gerald. My comments addressed the most urgent community matter possible: the systematic abuse of HOA authority and financial mismanagement under current leadership. I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. For the past 6 months, I have documented a pattern of selective enforcement, procedural violations, and financial irregularities that threaten the integrity of our community governance. Gerald reached for his gavel. "That topic is not on the approved agenda. Your time is concluded." Andrea stepped forward. "My client is addressing the emergency nature of this hastily called meeting, which is precisely on topic. Additionally, I should inform the board that interrupting him constitutes further evidence of attempting to suppress legitimate community concerns." Gerald's face darkened as he recognized Andrea as legal counsel. His gavel remained poised midair as he calculated his response. I continued methodically, presenting key evidence from our investigation. Financial records show over $40,000 in undocumented administrative fees during the past year. Landscaping and maintenance contracts have been awarded to companies with direct connections to board leadership at rates significantly above market value. Meeting minutes have been altered to remove objections and complaints. The room remained absolutely silent as I methodically outlined the evidence. Homeowners who had been unaware of the full scope exchanged shocked glances. Even several board members appeared disturbed by revelations about financial mismanagement they had apparently not been fully informed about. "Most seriously," I continued, "targeted enforcement has been weaponized against residents who question board decisions. My own property was subjected to escalating harassment culminating in the destruction of my boat through arson, an act witnessed by multiple community members and connected to leadership through security footage and eyewitness accounts." Gerald slammed his gavel repeatedly. "These are slanderous accusations without evidence. I will not allow this meeting to become a platform for baseless personal attacks." "The evidence is not baseless, Mr. Hartman," I replied calmly. It has been thoroughly documented, verified by legal counsel, and submitted to the county court, along with a petition signed by 32% of Oak Ridge homeowners. Andrea stepped forward again, opening her briefcase. Gerald Hartman, as legal counsel representing these homeowners, I am formally serving you with court documents regarding case number CV2023-875, petitioning for emergency injunction, freezing all HOA operations pending investigation of governance violations and financial improprieties pursuant to State Code Section 720.305. The room erupted in murmurs as Andrea placed the official documents before Gerald. His face cycled through expressions: disbelief, anger, calculation, and finally, a critical error in judgment. "This is absurd," Gerald shouted, rising from his chair. "That boat was an eyesore destroying our property values. Everything I have done has been to protect this community from people who refuse to maintain appropriate standards." The inadvertent admission echoed through the suddenly silent room. Board members physically distanced themselves from Gerald, recognizing the implications of his outburst. Vice President Wilson whispered urgently to Gerald, who seemed to suddenly realize what he had revealed. Andrea nodded to Frank, who had been recording the meeting with board permission requested at the beginning of the session. "We have that confession documented, Mr. Hartman. I suggest you carefully consider your next statements." The gavel slipped from Gerald's hand, landing with a final-sounding thud on the table. His carefully constructed facade of procedural authority had crumbled in an instant of uncontrolled rage. As he stared at the court documents before him, the reality of his situation appeared to finally register. The system he had manipulated for years had been turned against him through proper legal channels. The authority he had abused now faced legitimate challenge through established procedures. "This meeting is adjourned," Gerald finally stated, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone. He gathered his papers with shaking hands and exited quickly through the side door, avoiding eye contact with stunned board members and residents. As the room buzzed with reactions, Andrea confirmed quietly, "He has been officially served. The injunction hearing proceeds Friday regardless of his participation. Effective immediately, all HOA operations are temporarily suspended pending court review." The confrontation had unfolded exactly as planned, culminating in Gerald's damning admission and legal notification that would fundamentally transform Oak Ridge Estate's governance. The community had witnessed not just the presentation of evidence, but the real-time collapse of authority built on intimidation rather than legitimate leadership. As residents gathered in animated discussion groups, the atmosphere shifted palpably from tension to cautious hope. The first critical step toward accountability and reform had been successfully achieved. The impact of freezing HOA operations reverberated through Oak Ridge Estates with seismic force. Property management companies received court notification prohibiting fee collection. Maintenance contracts entered legal limbo, requiring emergency community volunteers to address essential services. The board could not issue violation notices or conduct official business. As community members adjusted to this unprecedented situation, unexpected patterns emerged that contradicted Gerald's long-standing warnings. Despite his repeated assertions that strict enforcement prevented neighborhood chaos, the community demonstrated remarkable self-regulation. Lawns continued receiving regular maintenance. Holiday decorations appeared with tasteful restraint. Trash cans disappeared promptly after collection. The predicted collapse of community standards without Gerald's iron fist proved entirely fictional. Judge Watkins granted the emergency injunction during Friday's hearing, which Gerald did not attend despite proper notification. His attorney presented weak procedural objections that wilted under examination of our extensive documentation. The judge authorized a forensic financial audit and appointed a neutral third-party administrator to oversee essential operations during the investigation. The evidence presented demonstrates substantial concerns regarding procedural integrity and financial management, Judge Watkins stated in her ruling. The court finds sufficient cause to maintain operational suspension pending comprehensive investigation. The police investigation into the boat arson gained new momentum following Gerald's damning admission during the community meeting. Detective Morris obtained search warrants for Gerald's financial records, communications, and property. The evidence discovered during these searches proved devastating. We found receipts for accelerant matching the chemical signature from the fire scene, Detective Morris informed me during our update meeting. His cell phone location data places him precisely at your property during the critical time frame. The case has been referred to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. The community response evolved from shocked confusion to organized adaptation. Neighbors established voluntary committees addressing maintenance needs during the operational freeze. The swimming pool, playgrounds, and common areas received attention from resident volunteers who discovered genuine satisfaction in collaborative community service. The forensic audit revealed financial improprieties exceeding our initial discoveries. Beyond the obvious conflicts of interest in vendor contracts, auditors uncovered systematic misappropriation of reserve funds, fabricated maintenance expenses, and undisclosed personal loans to Gerald from community accounts. The documented financial misconduct spanned his entire tenure as president and implicated several board members in failure of fiduciary responsibility. The financial violations alone would justify criminal charges, Andrea explained during our strategy meeting. Combined with the arson evidence, Gerald faces significant legal jeopardy on multiple fronts. The remaining board members attempted damage control through increasingly desperate settlement offers. Vice President Wilson approached me directly, suggesting substantial personal compensation in exchange for dropping the petition. His understanding of my motivation revealed how fundamentally Gerald had misread the situation from the beginning. We can arrange full replacement value for your boat plus additional compensation for emotional distress, Wilson proposed during an awkward encounter at the community mailboxes. All we ask is that you withdraw the petition and sign a confidentiality agreement regarding board activities. I studied his face, noting the nervous tension around his eyes. This was never about money, I explained calmly. This is about accountability and ensuring no one else experiences what I and others have endured. The boat cannot be replaced. Its value was not primarily financial. Wilson appeared genuinely confused by my response. Gerald had cultivated board members who viewed community relationships through purely transactional frameworks. The concept of principled action beyond personal gain seemed foreign to their understanding of human motivation. As the investigation progressed, community perception shifted dramatically. Residents who had initially supported Gerald or remained neutral began approaching coalition members with personal experiences of intimidation or unfair treatment. The culture of silence Gerald had carefully cultivated through fear and isolation dissolved as neighbors shared previously suppressed stories. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had always appeared to be Gerald's devoted supporter, revealed how he had threatened to expose her unauthorized home business if she failed to support his initiatives. The Thompsons disclosed how Gerald had implied building code complaints might be filed against their recent renovation if they questioned assessment increases. Each new revelation reinforced the systemic nature of the abuse and validated our legal intervention. The most profound transformation occurred in community gatherings that emerged during the operational freeze. Without the shadow of punitive enforcement, neighbors interacted with renewed openness and cooperation. The Volunteer Maintenance Committee evolved into regular community workdays that accomplished more with enthusiastic participation than paid contractors had achieved under Gerald's direction. Children played more freely in common areas. Impromptu weekend barbecues sprang up around the community pool. Oak Ridge Estates rediscovered its identity as a neighborhood rather than merely an association governed by regulations. Gerald remained conspicuously absent throughout these developments. Rumors placed him at his vacation property in another state, allegedly on advice from criminal defense counsel. His carefully constructed image of authoritative community guardian had collapsed completely, replaced by the reality of a vindictive manipulator facing serious legal consequences. The neighborhood he had sought to control through fear now thrived in his absence, the ultimate repudiation of his leadership philosophy. The formal criminal charges against Gerald arrived 3 months after the night he burned my boat. The district attorney filed multiple counts: second-degree arson, destruction of property, insurance fraud relating to HOA finances, and misappropriation of community funds. The evidence proved overwhelming, particularly after investigators obtained search warrants for his electronic devices and discovered incriminating text messages to Vice President Wilson discussing plans to solve the boat problem permanently. Gerald accepted a plea agreement rather than face trial. The terms included financial restitution, community service, and a prohibition from serving in any HOA leadership position nationwide. The man who had terrorized our neighborhood through procedural manipulation and intimidation now faced consequences through the legal system he had assumed he could navigate with impunity. The court-authorized special election transformed Oak Ridge Estates' governance. Candidate forums replaced secretive selection processes. Homeowners previously intimidated into silence actively participated in substantive discussions about community priorities. The election turnout reached 92% of eligible households, unprecedented engagement, compared to the typical 15% participation under Gerald's administration. The newly elected board reflected diverse perspectives united by commitment to transparency and collaborative governance. Financial committee members included residents with accounting backgrounds who established robust oversight protocols. Architectural review processes incorporated clear guidelines applying equally to all homeowners. Violation notices included specific bylaw references, photographic evidence, and appeal procedures prominently displayed. Most significantly, monthly meetings transformed from Gerald's tightly controlled performances into genuine community forums. The board positioned itself not as neighborhood enforcers, but as elected representatives accountable to residents. Meetings were live-streamed for homeowners unable to attend in person. Financial records became accessible through a secure community portal. The culture of secrecy that had enabled abuse dissipated under systematic transparency. I had not initially planned to seek leadership responsibility during this transition. My focus had remained on justice rather than governance. However, numerous neighbors encouraged my participation based on the thoughtful approach demonstrated throughout the legal challenge. After careful consideration, I accepted nomination to the Architectural Review Committee, where my design background offered relevant expertise. The emotional resolution regarding my destroyed boat arrived unexpectedly during a community planning session. Discussion had turned to utilization of common areas when Mrs. Peterson suggested creating a small lakeside gathering space near the community pond. The conversation evolved to incorporate a simple wooden deck extending over the water, a community space for peaceful reflection and connection. "We could name it for your boat," Frank suggested quietly. "The Coronado Deck, a place that transforms personal loss into community gathering." The proposal received unanimous approval. Insurance proceeds that had remained untouched in my account found purpose funding the project. Neighbors with carpentry experience volunteered labor alongside professional contractors. The design incorporated subtle nautical elements honoring the craftsmanship that Gerald had destroyed. My grandfather's lessons about boats now extended to an entire community learning to navigate shared governance with respect and cooperation. The completed deck became a favorite gathering place for residents of all ages. Children learned fishing skills from retired neighbors with patient expertise. Teenagers found quiet study space away from household distractions. Families celebrated milestones with community potlucks, where previously they had feared violation notices for excessive vehicles. The physical space embodied the transformed community spirit, built from destruction, but creating something more inclusive than individual ownership. Walking through Oak Ridge Estates 1 year after the fire, I marveled at the neighborhood's evolution. Gardens flourished with creative diversity now that residents felt secure exploring personal expression within reasonable guidelines. Children played freely in front yards, no longer constrained by excessive restrictions. Neighbors greeted each other warmly, having discovered genuine connection through collaborative problem-solving during the governance crisis. The HOA still existed, providing necessary structure for maintaining common assets and reasonable community standards. However, its character had fundamentally transformed from Gerald's weapon of control into its intended purpose, a framework for neighbors collectively nurturing shared community. Property values had actually increased during this period, contradicting Gerald's fundamental premise that only rigid enforcement protected financial interests. My boat remained irreplaceable in its sentimental value and craftsmanship. The violation of having something so personal deliberately destroyed left scars that time would never completely heal. Yet from that destruction had emerged something I never anticipated, not just personal justice, but community transformation. Gerald had burned my boat believing it would break my spirit and force my compliance with his distorted vision of neighborhood governance. Instead, the fire he ignited ultimately consumed the corrupt system he had constructed and forged a community stronger than he could have imagined. Standing on the Coronado deck during a perfect sunset, watching neighbors gather for an impromptu acoustic guitar performance by a talented teenager who would have faced violations for noise disturbance under previous leadership, I felt something Gerald likely never experienced despite his obsession with control. I felt the profound satisfaction of belonging to a community governed by mutual respect rather than fear. The peaceful waters reflected golden light as residents chatted comfortably around me, secure in their shared commitment to maintaining a neighborhood where rules existed to support community rather than suppress individuality. What Gerald never understood, throughout his calculated campaign of intimidation culminating in arson, was that genuine community cannot be enforced through regulations and violations. It emerges from shared values, mutual respect, and collective responsibility. He had burned my boat to break me, never imagining that from those ashes would rise not just personal resilience, but a transformed neighborhood that would stand as living testimony to the power of principled resistance against abuse of authority.